everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to share with you how I make my lacto-fermented sauerkraut. Really the only way that we typically eat sauerkraut is fermenting it, so that's what we're going to do today. We've got a bunch of garden fresh cabbages here that we are going to turn into yummy fermented sauerkraut. So I'm going to go ahead and start with this kind of medium cabbage, and then I have a really large one over here. We've got about 5 total, but I'll probably only do 2 or 3 of these, and I'm going to be using mason jars to ferment today. If you have a crock, that'll work too, but I really prefer the mason jar method. So I've got these half-gallon mason jars, and I have got these glass weights that are going to go on top to keep the cabbage down under the brine that we're going to make. And I have these fermenting lids which allow gases and air to escape the jar, but nothing can go back in. And they also have this little date gauge that you can spin around just to keep track of the date that you started it, so you don't have to label it necessarily if you don't want to. But we're also going to keep a leaf of our lettuce or cabbage to go on top, and then we'll put the weight on top of that, keep everything down under the water, and it'll be perfect. So that is the method that I'm going to use today. You'll just need your equipment for storing your cabbage, a cutting board, knife, your cabbage, some salt, and a big container to put it in, unless you're just making a smaller amount, and that's fine too. But you'll need some kind of bowl or whatever to put your cabbage in after you chop it. So today I'm just going to be chopping by hand. If you have some kind of food processor, you can use that. If you want to use like a grater, you can use that, but I prefer just cutting it by hand. That way I can get pretty uniform sizes, and I like my chunks a little bit bigger. If you do use like a food processor, it's a little bit harder to keep a consistent size, and you may over process it to where your pieces are really tiny, and maybe they're soft and you won't like it as much, so consider that. But it's not that much harder to just do it by hand, especially once you get it started. So I'm just gonna go ahead and start chopping away at this. Basically, I like to get mine into chunks, and then I go ahead and cut it into shreds from there. So we are going to just cut this off of our core. This is a flat Dutch cabbage, and this came out of the garden a couple days ago, and I soaked this in a saltwater solution just to make sure any pests or bugs or eggs or anything that could possibly be on it would be killed off, and it's clean. But these flat Dutch cabbages don't have quite the same core that your traditional cabbage might have. So it's a little bit different for me chopping it up, but I'm just going to get this into a few big chunks and get the top here off of it. And then we will shred from there. Something like that. And set that aside. That'll go to the pigs. Alright, and then once we get our chunks, now we're more manageable pieces, then we can go ahead and shred these. So I'm just going to cut in very small pieces. Once you get going, it's a little bit easier. And I'm just going to try to make them all about the same size. You can make your pieces as big or as small as you would like. And then as I get a bunch, I'm just going to scoop it into my container over here that I have to get my brine going. All right, so we got our 2 medium to largish cabbages all cut up. So I'm gonna go ahead and swap out my cutting board for our cabbage. So this is what we got here. Looks really good. This is quite a bit of cabbage, so I held off on cutting up this large one. It's gonna take a lot. So now it's time to make our brine, and that is comprised of salt and water. So the salt I'm using is the Redmond's Real Salt. That's basically all we use. So I'm gonna add some salt to this. Now the water is gonna come right out of the cabbage. So we're gonna add our salt, sprinkle it around in there, give it a good mix, and then we're gonna kind of massage it in for a little bit, about 5 minutes maybe. And then we're gonna let this rest for an hour like this. I'll drape a cotton towel over it, and we're just gonna let it sit here and let that water be drawn out of the cabbage by the salt. And then once that is done, after about an hour, we will then at that point pack our sauerkraut to be into our jars. So for 1 medium cabbage, you're going to want to put about 1 to 1.5 tablespoons of salt. So mine were a little bit medium, maybe on the large side, so I'm going to do 1.5 per cabbage, and I got 2 here, so I'm going to go ahead and just add 3 tablespoons of my Redmond's Real Salt. So I'm just going to sprinkle it all over. We're going to massage it in, so it doesn't have to be super accurate. So if you're nervous about not getting the right amount, don't think about it too much. You should have a good amount of salt to keep any bad bacteria from growing, but you don't want it so salty that it just doesn't taste good. So now that we put our salt on here, we're just gonna kind of massage it in. Make sure that we flip everything around so that the salt gets dispersed. And we're just gonna massage this in for about 5 minutes. So if you are doing a smaller amount, it's a little bit less intensive, a little bit less work. You could also invest in a pounder, one of those wooden kind of pounders. I just have never really needed it. I just use my hands. Make sure you have clean hands and you're good to go. Alright, so our cabbage is all massaged and ready to sit. So I got a clean cotton cloth, and we're just going to cover this up to keep any bugs from trying to go in there. And we're going to let this sit right here on our counter for an hour, and then we'll come back and stuff it into our jars. So we'll see you back here in just a second. Okay, so we have waited an hour, a little over an hour now, to let the water come out of the cabbage. So we're ready to go ahead and pack our sauerkraut into our jars. So there really doesn't look like there's a ton of water in there, but once we start really pressing that hard into our jar, you'll see just how much water there is. So if you end up being short with your brine, if you don't have enough of the water that comes out to cover your cabbage completely, then you can just make some more brine with some water and salt, and go ahead and add that on to it. But I typically don't have that problem. So I'm just going to use my jar and my canning funnel so that I hopefully don't make too big of a mess. And I've already cleaned my hands and everything, so we're just going to start shoving this in to our jar. And then get a few inches in there. If you're using like a canning jar like I am, get a few inches in there and then stick your hand in there. Let's move this out of the way. Stick your hand in there and really kind of press it down. You don't want any air hanging out down there. So we're just going to firmly pack that cabbage in. And once we get to the top, you're going to want to make sure to leave at least 3 or 4 inches from the top of your jar. I know it's tempting to come right up to the top, but as your cabbage sits and ferments on your counter, it's going to continue to, that salt's going to continue to pull the liquid out of your cabbage, and you will overflow salty cabbage water all over your counter. So you're going to want to make sure that you leave that gap. So I'm just going to keep pressing that in. A spoon, or if you have a kraut pounder or anything like that, you could use that. I just tend to use my knuckles like that in the jar, and that works for me. But maybe if you're using something where you can't get your hand in all conveniently like I can. Just like that. We are about to be full. Last time I made it, I had a little bit left and I didn't want it to go to waste, so I made it fit in the jar, and it was probably about this full. And by the next morning it was really full, so I just opened. If that happens to you, you can open your jar. Don't be afraid to open it and check on it. Now and again, I would just open the jar and pour a little bit of the excess liquid out. And I had to do that 2 or 3 times, probably over the course of its fermenting. Really the first few days. And then after that, you don't see a bunch of liquid coming off. All right. See how that is. All right, so we will stop right about here so we don't overflow too much. Now you can probably see that when I press down, there's a bunch of liquid that comes up. So we have a good amount of liquid here already. So when we cut up our cabbage, we saved a few pieces of our cabbage leaf. I'm going to go ahead and put these on the top just to hold down all those little pieces that might want to try and float. So even though I have a weight, I like to have this barrier to hold down all those little pieces. All right, and then I have my little glass weight that I'm going to go ahead and set on top. And then I need some more liquid in here, so we'll try and get some of the liquid out of here without dumping the rest of our cabbage. Just to where it is covered. I should probably get a screen so I don't get more cabbage in there, but we'll be okay. Alright, so we got our jar all filled up, and all the cabbage is under the water. You want to try and make sure everything is covered in water so you don't get mold or yucky stuff growing on top. I got my weight on there. Everything is submerged, so I'm going to use my handy little fermenting lid. Just screw that on tight. And let's see, I don't know what the date today is, so I'll have to check. But I will label this anyways with today's date and how long I ferment it with usually. So I like to ferment my sauerkraut for a minimum of 10 days. So at about 10 days, I go ahead and open it up and we try it and see if we like the flavor that it's at. It depends on your weather and things of that nature, how warm it is, and how much stuff you have growing up in your cabbages. But so a minimum of 10 days, and go ahead and check it if you like the flavor. If you don't, you can leave it longer. Sometimes it might take up to a month or so for it to get to your liking. And once it is to your liking, you can go ahead and swap out your fermenting lid for a regular jar lid and go ahead and put that in the refrigerator or down in your root cellar, and it will store there for quite some time. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and set that aside, and we have a bunch of cabbage left here, so I'm going to go ahead and get my next jar filled up, and we're just going to do the same thing. So we got our sauerkraut all ready, and I'm just going to leave this on my kitchen counter, like I said, for about 10 days, and then we will check it from there and see if it's done. Once it's done, we'll put that in the fridge. You can leave this right on the counter. That's what I do. I just try to keep it out of direct sunlight, so if you have a window where the sun shines directly in onto your counter or whatever, you probably want to avoid placing it right there. So I keep it in a kind of a shady spot in my kitchen. Also, if you have other ferments going on your counter, say a sourdough or kefir or something like that, you're probably going to want to keep your sauerkraut on the opposite side of your kitchen so that you don't cross-contaminate your ferments. But I think that's about it, you guys. It's very, very easy. I hope that you guys try this, and you know, maybe you can experiment on adding different flavors and stuff to it down the road. But I hope that you guys enjoyed this video and found it useful, and hopefully you subscribe and stick around, and we'll see you guys next time.